what are the challenges, some of the successes, and what can be done and why. The title of my presentation is Israel is no South Africa. So why BDS? Why boycott, divestment, and sanctions? By the end of the presentation, I hope you'll see the answer to this question, that boycott is not only a valuable tool when a country is identical to South Africa, it is useful whenever a country is in violation of international law in a persistent way. The BDS movement is very much inspired by the struggle in South Africa against apartheid, especially the boycott and divestment and sanctions that were held against the apartheid regime in South Africa. Mandela famously said, "Our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." Just to give some background, it's a bit noisy, I don't know what this machine is doing, but anyway. The map on your left is the map of British Mandate Palestine. Palestine pre-1948, historical Palestine. The map next to it, to the right, is the 1947 UN partition plan, which divided the historical land of Palestine into two states. The yellow part is what would have become. Is that program?
Yeah, I'm sure.
This one. Good.
Sure. That's much better.
Okay. So the second map is the UN partition plan, which would have divided Palestine into two states. The white one would have been the Jewish state, and the yellow one would have been the Arab state. Of course, these terms do not mean an exclusivist Jewish state or an exclusivist Arab state. Neither state would have had the right to expel anyone or to exclude anyone. Further to the right is the 1967 borders, the de facto borders after the 1967 war, before the 1967 war, where Israel occupied the entire white area, and then later in the 1967 war occupied the yellow parts, the West Bank and Gaza. The far to your right is the map we have now, with the Palestinian enclaves reduced to those yellow patches surrounded entirely by the State of Israel or by Israel's illegal settlements in the occupied territories. The latest statistics, according to the Palestinian Bureau of Statistics in 2012, is that we have 11.6 million Palestinians today, of whom 50% live in exile outside historical Palestine, that is the State of Israel, the West Bank and Gaza. 12% are Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel. 38% are Palestinians in the occupied territories, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Gaza. Why is this important? The total number of refugees among Palestinians is 69%, and 31% are non-refugees. So how did we reach this number? As we said, 38% are in the West Bank and Gaza. Of those, more than 40% are refugees or internally displaced persons. And of the 12% of the Palestinians who are citizens of the State of Israel, about 300,000 are internally displaced persons. What does that mean? They're citizens of the State of Israel, but they're not allowed to go to the villages from which they were ethnically cleansed in 1948, simply because they're not Jewish, due to their identity. Altogether, the percentage of refugees then is 69%, and the non-refugees are 31%. This is important because anyone who says, I support Palestinian rights under international law, and therefore I want to end the occupation, that does not address the basic rights of the Palestinian people. To address the Palestinian people's rights under international law, we've got to address the three basic segments: Palestinians in the occupied territories, Palestinians in Israel, and Palestinians in exile. This is why the BDS call, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions call, that was issued by Palestinian civil society, the overwhelming majority of Palestinian civil society, on July 9th, 2005, called for three basic rights: ending the 1967 occupation, West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Gaza, including the illegal colonies, the wall, and so on. Ending the system of racial discrimination in Israel. So if we forget the occupied territories, we talk about Israel itself, ending the system of racial discrimination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and I'll get to that. Because this is a very controversial issue. What is it? Apartheid, we just said it's not identical to South Africa, so how come apartheid? We'll discuss that. The third point, the most important point, is recognizing the Palestinian refugees' right to return in accordance with UN Resolution 194. The BDS call was issued because Palestinians reached the conclusion that the United Nations, under US hegemony, was unable, unwilling, or both, to deliver our rights, to compel the State of Israel to recognize Palestinian rights. So we resorted to what South Africans did during apartheid, calling on international communities to stand in solidarity with the Palestinians through BDS. Boycott boils down to a very simple principle, which Martin Luther King Jr. Spoke about. That is, withdrawing support for an evil policy or system. This was in the Montgomery bus boycott, when Martin Luther King was criticized. Why are you calling for boycotting this bus company and so on? He said boycott is withdrawing support for an evil system. So it's a basic obligation. It's not something heroic, it's not something major that we're asking people to do. Withdraw your support and your complicity in a system that's evil. The very basic principle of BDS is that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Basic in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This will be extremely important throughout the presentation, remembering that all human beings deserve equal rights, regardless of ethnicity, religion, gender, or any identity attribute. One of the authors of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Stéphane Hessel, a Holocaust survivor and diplomat at large in France, said, BDS campaigns around the world present the most promising way to overcome the failure of world governments to stand up to Israel's intransigence and lawless behavior. End of quote. The BDS movement is a global movement. Its Palestinian anchor, its Palestinian reference is the BDS National Committee, or the BNC, which is the absolute largest coalition in Palestinian civil society. It includes political parties, trade unions, women's unions, NGO networks, refugee networks, and so on and so forth. Again, the BNC sees the BDS call as a major effort to get recognition for Palestinian rights, the three Palestinian rights, without which we cannot exercise our inalienable right to self-determination: ending occupation, ending apartheid, and the right of return. Let's talk about the occupation, the 1967 occupied territories. That's the most understood aspect of Israel's oppression system against the Palestinians, so I won't dwell on it a lot. From the colonization of occupied Jerusalem, to the siege of Gaza, to some very racist remarks written by fanatic settlers in Hebron, Arabs to the gas chambers. There are other aspects to the occupation that are less understood. Perhaps this is a bit understood. In Israel's war on Gaza 2008-2009, it used illegal weapons such as white phosphorus to attack UN shelters, where mainly women and children were escaping from the war. Another aspect is denial of access to water resources, as Amnesty International issued a report in 2009 explaining that Israel systematically denies access to water to Palestinians as a means of expulsion. As a means of expulsion. What does this entail? Just a very quick example. If you're a villager in the South Hebron Hills, for example, and you want to harvest rainwater, something Palestinian farmers have been doing for generations, for centuries, now it's not allowed. There are military laws that prevent you from digging a well or building a cistern to collect rainwater on your private farm land. It's illegal. Israel would send its bulldozers, usually Caterpillar, and destroy the water wells. Another aspect that's less understood in the Israeli occupation system is the prevalent racism within Israeli society. Some Israeli sociologists and some Israeli educators have reflected on this issue, how the occupation and the violence committed against the Palestinians is corrupting what they refer to as corrupting Israel's society itself. This is one example that was published in Haaretz, the famous prominent Israeli paper. Israeli army platoons compete who can produce the most obnoxious designs of t-shirts. The more controversial, the better, the more popular they become. This is one t-shirt design that became very popular. It has crosshairs on a Palestinian woman's belly, pregnant woman, and it says in English, 1 shot, 2 kills. Another aspect of the occupation, using Palestinians, civilians, including children, as human shields. This was documented by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty International, by B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, and several other human rights organizations. One particular case that became famous and widely covered even in the Western media in 2004, it says, the day Israel used a boy, age 13, as a human shield. The subtitle above it says, teenager tied to police vehicle to stop his friends throwing stones. His arm, where you see the white circle, is tied to the army jeep. And the wall, which is a bit covered in the Western media, is understood and declared illegal by the International Court of Justice in 2004. Now that's the occupied territories of 67. If we talk about the pre-67, the 48 territory, the State of Israel, there's the apartheid issue. Some people say the apartheid analogy, but is it an analogy? When we say Israel is using apartheid, applying apartheid policies, are we saying that Israel is identical to South Africa? No, we're not. Because apartheid is not only a South African crime, it's a universal crime defined by the UN Convention for the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid, which was passed by the UN in 1973. It is defined as a systematic form of oppression by one racial group against another that's legalized and institutionalized. So it's not simply racial discrimination, it's a systematic oppression that's legalized. Israel today has dozens of laws that discriminate between its Jewish citizens and its non-Jewish citizens, the indigenous Palestinians. As was revealed by one media monitoring organization here in the US, in the last Israeli elections, if we take the entire population under Israel's control, that is within the State of Israel as well as the West Bank and Gaza, because all of these are under Israel's control, in fact, 49% only of this entire population got to vote in the Israeli elections. 51%, 6.1 billion Palestinians and other non-Jews were not allowed to participate. They were totally disenfranchised from the elections. So Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel are included in the 49%, whereas Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza and other non-Jews are out of the 51% of the entire area under Israel's control that were disenfranchised. This is one of the reasons why even the UN Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, 9 March last year, said that Israel is in violation of the prohibition against apartheid. This is one of the precedent reports coming out of the UN saying that Israel is indeed guilty of the crime of apartheid. South African Christian leaders went farther than that, saying Israeli apartheid is, quote, in its practical manifestation even worse than South African apartheid, end of quote. And they should know something about apartheid. The Russell Tribunal, which is a popular tribunal of civil society, reached a similar conclusion that Israel's rule over the Palestinian people, wherever they reside, collectively amounts to a single integrated regime of apartheid. One aspect of this apartheid is land ownership. By various bureaucratic and legal means, 93% of the land of Israel is only for Jewish development. It's mainly done through the Jewish national funds controlling power in the Israel Land Administration, plus the land that the JNF directly controls. About 14% of the land of Israel is entirely, only, exclusively for the Jewish citizens of the state. Another aspect of apartheid within Israel, we're not talking about the occupied territories, within the State of Israel, is the so-called unrecognized Palestinian villages, like Al-Araqib in the Naqab or Negev, which was demolished dozens of times. And every time it's demolished, Palestinians and people in solidarity with them, including progressive Israelis, go back and rebuild it. And then the bulldozers go and reduce it to rubble. The last part I want to talk about within the State of Israel, that's hardly ever talked about. During the Nakba, the 1948 ethnic cleansing of the majority of the indigenous Palestinians, According to a Jewish Israeli academic at Ben Gurion University, his research documented that Israel destroyed tens of thousands of Palestinian books that were pillaged from Palestinian homes, libraries, and schools. Tens of thousands of Palestinian books. The third aspect of BDS, the third basic right, so we talked about ending the occupation, ending apartheid. The third is the right of return for refugees. And this is an inherent right that all refugees around the world should enjoy. Jewish refugees of World War II enjoy that right. Refugees from Kosovo, Bosnia, every refugee around the world has a right to go home. It's a basic right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Without recognizing the rights of all Palestinians, then we're saying that we don't believe in equality for all Palestinians. We don't believe that Palestinians are equally human to everyone else. And as the late Edward Said said, it's equality or nothing. That's the most basic principle that Palestinians cannot compromise on. Equal rights, like everyone else. Because without equality, we would be reduced to relative humans. Humans only in the relative sense. We're not full humans. Therefore, we don't deserve the full set of rights that humans deserve. That's an inherently racist conception that if we don't believe in equality, we'll have to recognize. And that racism feeds off of racism in this country and feeds the racism in this country. I'll leave the cartoon to speak for itself.
Okay.
One aspect of the US complicity in Israel's violations of international law is that annual billions of dollars given to Israel in military aid, in other forms of aid, in tax-deductible, charitable donations to Israel. But on top of all that, in 2009, the US administration decided to give Israel $30 billion extra dollars over the next 10 years, between 2009 and 2018. $30 billion on top of the billions and billions that Israel already gets. This is at a time when the US economy is facing some serious problems, fiscal problems, financial problems, unemployment is rising, healthcare, education, cuts, pensions, and so on. At this time, the US sees it fit to send Israel $30 billion extra dollars in military aid, mind you, military aid to Israel. Just to take one example, the state of Illinois. Forget California, it's too big. So I took just a typical state in the United States. Illinois' share of this $30 billion over 10 years would come out to $1.5 billion. Instead of spending this money in the state of Illinois, over 17,900 affordable housing units, it's being sent to Israel. Or Illinois could have spent that $1.5 billion over 24,000 green jobs training. Or healthcare. It could have spent it on 1 million plus primary healthcare for the uninsured. So why is that happening? As Archbishop Desmond Tutu says, the Israeli government is placed on a pedestal in the United States, and to criticize it is to be immediately dubbed anti-Semitic. People are scared in this country to say wrong is wrong. I shall address the anti-Semitism issue. Perhaps I'll expand on it in the question and answer period, but just very quickly, the BDS movement categorically rejects every form of racism, including anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and so on. This is not something that we shyly say. This is explicit in all our documentation. Anti-Semites are not welcome in our movement because this is a human rights movement that's based on the rights of all humans. We do not tolerate any form of racism, including anti-Semitism. But what about peace? Some people might say, oh, boycott, isn't that contrary to peace? We want to achieve peace. Well, to the Palestinians or to any oppressed community, that term is meaningless if devoid from justice. Because any peace in a situation of oppression without justice is understood to maintain a master-slave type of relationship, oppressor-oppressed type of relationship. So peace without justice is an institutionalization of injustice. And it's not enough for the master to be a bit nicer. and to expect the slave to be a bit happier, because that's still peace without justice. The point is to end a